speaker tonight is no stranger to the many members of this genealogy club. We've enjoyed his presentation over a number of years, and his many visits to Ireland have given him a definite perspective and an historical context to his family stories. Tom was a teacher for 40 years, all levels from elementary to graduate school, and he continues to this day to pass on his research and knowledge for our benefit today. Please welcome Tom Toohey.
Thank you very much, Jan. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to talk about one of my favorite subjects, Irish history. Now, disclaimer, I'm not a historian. You know, back in the 50s, there was this man that would come on TV and he'd be dressed up in medical garb, and he'd say, I'm not a doctor, I just play a doctor on TV. Well, I'm not a historian, I just play a historian here at the library, and a genealogist as well. But I enjoy investigating these things, and if any of you are still in the 7th or 8th grade, I have a teacher's certificate to teach history in the 7th and 8th grade. Not that I ever used it. But anyway, that might be enough certification to do what I'm doing tonight, because I'm doing a broad overview. And if some of you have things to add, I'd like to know about it. Irish history is such a huge subject. When you go take a course in American history, you might start with Jamestown or the Pilgrims or whatever and go forward from around 1600. You know, you can go back to Ireland 1,600,000 years and study things that happened. So, you know, there's a huge amount of information even before the beginning of what we think about as America. Yes, we know the Spaniards came and there were Indians and all that, but lots of times it isn't covered in American history courses. So tonight we're going to go back in time. Does everybody have a handout? I saw a couple people come in and make sure they have it here. You see this handout has a timeline, yes, that gives information about some of the subjects we're going to cover today. There's a few more that I've added to it as well. The timeline is part of a wall chart that a company in Dublin made, and I tried to get a copy of it. It was 3 feet by 4 feet. I couldn't get it back to the States very easily, and they wanted $75 for it. And I said, well, you know, what about if I just took the image off your website? And they said, oh, you can do that. Teachers all over Ireland do that anyway. So here it is, but I wouldn't go about publishing it if I had an idea of doing that. It's just, it is something that is not my original composition, and I want to make that clear tonight. Anyway, to get started here, you can see how far we're going to go back here before Christ. And we need to have a little music to get started. Whoops. Turn that up a little bit. Okay, before there was, well, here's a Irish joke. We better start with that. I can remember going into several pubs in Ireland when I first went there, and had some man come up to me and he'd say, you know, you're a Yank, aren't you? You're here on holiday. And I'd say, oh, yes. He said, did you go to the Cliffs of Moher? And I'd say, oh, yes, 3 times. And then he'd say, did you see them? And I'd say, no, because I don't know how many of you have been to the Cliffs of Moher, which are very beautiful, but the Cliffs of Moher are often shrouded in mist and rain. And the early Irish history is lost in Irish myths as well. Myths and mists. You have to be careful how we pronounce it. So here's the chart that I mentioned, the timeline. And Ireland existed before the Irish, of course, but it wasn't where it is today. First of all, it was a landmass off of the coast of Australia. And then, because of plate tectonics, it got moved across the world up near England and Scotland where it is today. That's quite a difference from what we think about Ireland. And before the Ice Ages, there probably wasn't much life there. If there was, it got wiped out by the Ice Age. Here's where the ice was in the last Ice Age, which was about 6,000 years before Christ. Now, as the ice receded, people thought about various ancestors that might be there, like Adam and Eve. They thought about it being Eden. Or they might have thought about it being a place where the lost tribes of Israel went. And then there were some other people that wrote that they thought that Noah landed there with his ark and his sons populated Ireland. But of course, all of that isn't true. The early ancestors were probably hunter-gatherers who were at the edge of the ice, and they had some root crops and captured rabbits and other small game, and eventually the Irish deer and bison and so forth that were there. As the ice receded, it left a land bridge between Scotland and Ireland, and people came across it. You see the dotted line there goes down to Clare. There's evidence that there was a cave there with people living in it about 4,000 years before Christ. There's another cave in Waterford that has a similar story. As time went on, the ice melted up into the north, and more water was available for the oceans, and so this land bridge disappeared. And so people came over in small boats. So some of the early Irish that are mentioned in the sagas would be the Firbog, that were short, swarthy type people. Let's see if we can get that to work. And then the Tuatha, the people of the goddess of Danu. And they were more elegant, taller. They were better craftsmen. They were poets. They were musicians. And their tales are sung about still today. Many times these two groups battled for control of the island. As time went on, there were Irish farmers there as well. By the way, those two groups before, they've now become the underground people, the little people in Ireland. They've become the leprechauns and the fairies. And they still live in the caves, they say. Anyway, about 4,000 BC, there were farmers that came there, and they lived along the coast in a number of places, especially one place called Casia Fields. Where's that? That's in Mayo. Here's an arrow showing where it is. And as you can see over on the right-hand side, on the Sligo side of the bay, there's Enniscrone and Kilglass. Now, those people that know me well know how I talk about my Tooheys that are really toughies. They came from that area. And when I go to visit my toughie relatives there, they take me many different places, and my cousin Patty took me up to Casia Fields, and I'm going to show you what I found there. So here's the visitors center, and you can see that most of the area is covered with bog, except every once in a while there's a stone wall that's been exposed. So when the farmers were there, there wasn't the bog. The bog was formed afterward. And when you think about how long it takes to form a bog, about 100 years for an inch, it took a long time for this bog to form over the walls. Now some people dug out that wall to show where it is. And here's a local lad here who's probing the bog. And as you can see, he has a rod and he pushes it down. You can see how deep the bog is. He's looking for one of those stone walls or a stone hut. There's his cousin talking. Got to turn that up a little bit. Okay, so you get the idea there. Going forward, we have the megalithic tombs that are built about 3000 BC. Now, at first there were rather small tombs built, but the most important group of tombs is found in the Boyne Valley, including Newgrange here. It's a huge tomb. You can see a diagram of it here. Here's the entrance, and there's a passageway that goes back to a chamber in the middle of the tomb. And it's about 2 2/3 acres in size, and it took 30 years to build. Now you might say, 30 years? Well, maybe 1,000 men worked on it carrying baskets of soil up the hill from the riverbank and dumped it in this mound. And then they had to get all the rocks. Some of the rocks came from 100 miles away, special rocks that reflected the sunlight to show the magnificence of this tomb. Here is a short video that explains the tomb.
Newgrange comes at the end of maybe 1,000 years of development of what we call passage tombs, because basically there's a passage which leads into a chamber, and they were burial places. But also they're much more than that. They're important sites that were obviously built for important people and by important people who could command manpower, maybe womanpower, but probably manpower, to make such big structures.
Deep inside the tomb on the back wall of the burial chamber, there is another triple spiral. A key element of the magic and mystery of Newgrange is the roof box positioned over the entrance. 5,000 years ago, the structure was designed to catch the first rays of light from the rising sun on the shortest day of the year.
We just had the shortest day of the year.
Or, as such, wouldn't get very far, it would only get a fraction of the way. So the light is actually trapped much higher up, above the floor levels, and then it gets into the tomb and reaches right into the back chamber, which is also interesting because it bounces off the back wall of the very end chamber and lights up the spirals, and they're lit by the reflected light of a hugely sophisticated piece of engineering.
Okay, usually there's another wire here. You probably noticed that the custodian was helping me with the wire, and that wire has a transmitter that would send the sound up into the speakers. So I'm sorry that I only have the small speaker on my computer here, but you get a sense of how the roof box works to get the light into the back of the tomb and light up that spiral. Now, some of you have seen that spiral on some cards I have and some other things that I've shown. There's various interpretations of it. Some people think that it is a vision of the sun because they were worshippers of the sun, but others think the 3 spirals represent the present, the past, and the future, or our life here on earth and the life below, the underground, and the life above in the sky. There's many interpretations of that. Nobody really knows. But anyway, it gives you some ideas about some of the religious symbolism in this particular situation. I'll skip over this. And here's that local lad again at the front of the entrance, and you can see the spirals there. Next picture is of my son, Sean. He was a religion major, so I thought it was important that he comparative religion major. He wanted to get a PhD in comparative religion and teach it at the college level. And so I said, before you do that, you better find out what the market is. So when he was a senior, he looked into it, and there was one job that year, and it was in Wisconsin. He said, I got to do something else. He went on the road with a rock band and then became an attorney. So I guess. Anyway, that gives you some idea what's going on. So 700 BC, the Celts came to Ireland. And the Celts, very interesting group of people. I first was studying that by reading the works of Brian Sykes, PhD from Oxford. And he wrote a book called Saxons, Vikings, and Celts. Now, I've loaned this book to somebody. It might have been here, somebody here, but I haven't gotten it back. So if any of you got it, I want it back again. Anyway, his thinking informed a lot of other people too, and I'll show you some of the ideas they had. Okay, another person that is an authority on this is Ken Nichols, Dr. Nichols, and I heard him speak in Sligo in 2013. He spoke for 2 hours without a slideshow, without a note. He spoke in English, Irish, and in Latin. And everybody in the place was sitting on the edge of their seat. He's one of the most remarkable speakers I ever heard in my life. Many of you have Surnames of Ireland, the book, by and he was an authority on that book as well. But he has very fixed ideas that are related to what Sykes had. Another person that was there was J.P. Mallory, Dr. Mallory. He's a Yank who teaches at University, the Queen's College in Belfast, and he wrote The Origin of the Irish. And his ideas are that the Irish came from many different places, the Celts came from many different places. And he spoke after Dr. Nichols. He got about halfway through his remarks. Dr. Nichols got up and started yelling at him and shaking his fist and came up and threatened to hit him. And the person who was in charge of the conference had to get between the two men and separate them because they had two different ideas about the Irish, okay? So the Irish are very passionate about this. If you go to an Irish conference, it's mostly men, very few women, and they all know where their grandfather came from. He came from that derelict house up on the hill, but what they want to know is where their people originated, where the name originated, what it means, and how they got to where they are now. So that was the big topic of discussion at that conference. So where did the Celts start here? Well, people generally think that they started over near the Black Sea, and they were not an ethnic group that you could define by DNA, but it was a group that spoke the same language. And over time, they moved to Tern Valley near Switzerland, and they broke into two groups. And one group went across the Alps to France, and they became the Gauls. You know Charles de Gaulle. You've heard of the Gauls that Caesar wrote about in the Gaelic Wars, okay? That they were Gaelic, they were Celtic. And the other group went south. Oh, they prospered. And went south to the Adriatic Sea, got in boats, went around Italy, all the way along the coast of France, over to Spain. Some of them stopped along here, and then some went through the straits and landed near Portugal, and were there. And those two groups expanded and were successful there. Now, over time, there was a lighthouse built up here at the point at the top of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, later, the Romans rebuilt it and made it bigger. It's called the Tower of Hercules. But back in earlier times, there was a lighthouse there, and the Celts looked across the ocean, and they thought they saw an island out there. Now, it's kind of hard to believe because it's 2,000 miles up there. But anyway, maybe they just heard that there was an island out there. Some fishermen found maybe going along the coast and eventually getting out toward Ireland. And so they decided to go there, and they landed there. And other groups probably came from France and probably other parts of Europe, went to Wales and to Scotland. So all of these are Celtic groups. Now, why did they go this way? Why did they travel west? Well, remember, they were worshipers of the sun, and they were following the sun as it went westward every day. And they saw that it dove into the Great Sea out to the west of Ireland, and they thought that it went underground and came up again the next day over in the east, and they saw it again. So there's a reason why they went there. We're not too sure, but that's a speculation. So here are the Celts coming ashore. At earlier times, people thought about the Celts as invading Ireland, but there's no evidence that there were any battles. So what happened? Well, they were handsome, they were beautiful, they just moved in and they intermarried with the local tribe. And so over time, their DNA took over. Here's what it was like in 100 AD. Remember, they came there first in 700 AD. Now 100 AD, there's quite a few tribes of Celts throughout Ireland. Only in the northwest, there are very few. What did they leave? Celtic art. Right here we have Ogham stones. Ogham was a god of the Celts, and he invented writing. And you can see this stone with the lines on it that's a simplified kind of writing that would indicate a burial place or a boundary marker. Here's the more curvilinear kind of style of art that they made. And you can see that later on, it turned into things like the Book of Kells. Lots of times there are fantastic paintings or carvings of animals or distorted people within these documents or stones. Here's a parish in Tyrone. Now the parishes were set up by the English later on, but this parish is Ardstra. I know it well because my McBrides and my McDevitts came from there. The reason I chose it was that it's divided into townlands. Townlands are Celtic division. Those are the areas that a family or a clan had as their own areas. I've colored a couple of them here. You can see Castlebane in the reddish color and Drumna Bay in the bluish color. Castlebane is where my great-grandfather James McBride came from, and he went across the hill to Drumna Bay to woo Mary McDivitt. Of course, his brother went across to woo Jane McDivitt, too. Those McDivitt girls, they must have been hot stuff. The whole clan came over, including the mothers, to West Rutland, Vermont, and eventually to Dorset, Vermont. So they left behind their DNA, the surnames, the place names, and the Irish culture, music, dance, and so forth. St. Patrick comes to Ireland, and the next most important thing. So in 432, he came to Ireland to convert the Irish to Christianity. Here's a representation of him. Notice he's driving the snakes out of Ireland there in the bottom left-hand corner. That was pretty easy because there weren't any snakes there. This is a metaphor for the fact that he drove the devil out of Ireland, the devil being the pagans, the Druids. So these stories get embellished sometimes. So where did he start? He started in Wales. Now remember I said that Wales and Scotland were Celtic as well, but they spoke a slightly different form of Gaelic. There's the P Gaelic and there's the Q Gaelic. So the people in Wales and Scotland speak P Gaelic, and so the name Patrick can be found in those areas. Patrick was not known in Ireland prior to St. Patrick being there. It's very popular now, but back in those times, there weren't any Patricks. So when he was a boy, some pirates captured him and took him around the coast of Ireland and sold him to a sheep farmer up in Mayo. And so for many years, he had to tend the sheep up there as a kind of slave. After a while, when he was a teenager, he escaped and he walked across Ireland, and somehow he talked a captain of a ship that he found along the coast there to take him back to Wales. When he got back to Wales, he had a conversion, or he had an epiphany of trying to become a priest and going back to minister to the Irish. So in those days, to become a priest, you had to go to the continent, across the English Channel here, and study at a seminary, and then come back. So when he got back to his home, he then went off to Ireland. He tried to go ashore and preach there, but they didn't let him. They didn't want him. Remember, they were pagan at that point. Went further up the coast. No, didn't work. Couldn't get in there. Finally went up to what we know as Antrim today, and yes, they accepted him, and he went there and he started preaching. Now, he's pretty famous. He had a good publicist himself. He wrote a book, Confessions of his life, and other people wrote about him, and he's quite well known. But he did not have the orders from a bishop or the Pope to go and convert the Irish. He did it on his own. The guy that was supposed to go there and do it was Palladius. And a lot of people, the work that was done, said to be done by Patrick, was really done by him. So there's really two Patricks, so to speak. You can both see them both here with their shamrocks. So here's his confessions that he used to publicize his travels. And here's some Christian icons that are associated with him, this bell. And of course, the Celtic cross. You notice that it is a cross and a circle. The cross is a linear kind of thing. And in Christian time, we think from BC forward, from the beginning of time. It's linear, where the Irish don't think that way. They think more in a circular way. They think about the circle of the day, morning, noon, night. They think about the month with all the different shapes, sizes of the moon, of the year with all the different seasons, of a life with childhood and middle age and death. And so that's why this was combined this way. Another thing too, there is all of this storytelling going on this cross. This one's probably about the crucifixion, but I've seen crosses that show Jonah and the whale, for instance, or some other biblical story. So before people, most Irish didn't read or write, so this is a way of publicizing a story, telling the story in stone. And of course the shamrock is a symbol that's associated with Patrick too. It's three parts in one. And in Catholicism, there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in one. And this appealed to the Irish because the Irish were polytheistic. They had several different gods that they might worship. And so they liked the idea of combining them in one, though, like this. So as he went around and preached, he used these icons and other things to help him. He took pagan places and he made them Christian. For instance, he took wells, and he took lots of other things, mountains, and made them Christian. Went to Downpatrick, Shane, Sleamish. These are all different places that he went around the thing. I have slideshows about Crowpatrick and Loch Derg, for instance, and I mentioned some other things here. Here's a holy well. I was mentioning them, St. Patrick's Well. It's a fantastic well near Clonmel, right near where my meanies are. My meanies live in Ballyporeen, which is about 8 miles to the west of this. And I've been to Clonmel many times. You see the little red icon over on the left there where St. Patrick's Well is. St. Patrick's Well. And David is going to speak to us. He's the custodian for the well.
This church was built between 1418 and 1420 by monks from the Abbey of Innislownot, which is down here in the village of in the present village of Malafit.
Great.
This was one of the biggest Cistercian abbeys in the country at the time. They owned nearly 20,000 acres of land. This site would have been on their land. So monks came up here, built this monastery, built this church.
Yes.
This church originally had a thatched roof, as had most buildings. in that period.
Right.
So the monks operated the church here from 1420 when they had it built until 1650. In 1650, Cromwell besieged Clonmel.
Yes, I know that.
At the siege of Clonmel in 1650,
Right.
Cromwell broke the roof of this church.
Oh, they did.
So this church hasn't been used since 1650.
St. Patrick himself above the well.
This is supposed to be the best water in the world. It's been
yeah.
tested against it. Yeah, it's been tested against 91 countries.
Yes, and you know, this was, you know where I went? I went to the Hawks Well.
Oh, did you?
To the Hawks Well up in Sligo.
Oh, the house comes here, though, yeah.
And according to legend, if you drink the water out of that well, you have eternal youth.
Well, I keep telling people the same thing here. Drink the water out of this well. The secret to it.
This is the fraud. So he claimed that his water gave eternal life, okay? I'm always amazed at how many really interesting and articulate people that I meet as I travel around Ireland who are doing, you know, relatively, you know, simple jobs. He kept that place immaculate, and it was, but he knew all about it too. So it was very, very interesting to talk with him. So here's Downpatrick Head up in Mayo again. Remember, my toughies are over here on the right-hand side of the bay, and Patrick and Chris took me up there, and it's kind of dangerous there because there are all these cliffs along the edge of the ocean right there. There's the head, the peninsula going up to the end of that land, and as you can see out beyond the peninsula, there is a sea stack. And there's a story about that sea stack that involves St. Patrick that I'm going to show you right here. This is my wife Barbara on the left, and Chris Tuffy, my cousin's wife, there on the right. And so St. Patrick came up here to this peninsula, and there was a pagan king living out on the end of it, and he went to convert the king, but the king wouldn't have any of it, okay? He wouldn't be converted. So St. Patrick got very angry. So he had his staff with him, his bishop's staff. So he raised it, and he hit the rock connecting the stack to the mainland, and he destroyed it. And the king, of course, got very upset. And St. Patrick went away, leaving him there. So anyway, that's the story. I don't know if it's true or not. You can believe it or not. Here's St. Patrick's grave right here, okay? And here's the monastery at Clonlamoy, which is a fantastic site right on the Shannon River. Let's see. Okay. And in the 8th century through 1014, the Vikings came to Ireland. And you see that helmet with the horns? Now, the Vikings never had helmets like that. If you were in a battle with horns on your head, some guy would grab a hold of it and knock you down. But their helmets were more like this. They were just smooth metal helmets. And they were a terror to the Irish and many other people at that time. They came down from the North Country in boats like this. They used the sail to get across the sea, but they could row this boat as well, as we'll see in a minute. And one of their favorite things to attack were monasteries, because monasteries were very prosperous. It was kind of a commune of married priests, nuns, and monks. And it was very efficient, and so they were able to gather in a lot of crops and raise lots of fine animals, and they also had lots of gold and silver there and chalices and so forth. So they were prime targets for the Vikings. So what was the thing that the Vikings did? They built round towers like this, and when the Vikings were sighted, they would go up into the round tower and put all their valuables up in the tower, pull up any ladders, and barricade any openings, And if the Vikings tried to climb up the tower, they would knock down their ladders or throw rocks at them or something to keep them away. Here's a cutaway view of it to show how they would get up into the top of the tower. Here's a view of a Viking ship that's being rowed up a river. So they would sail across the ocean and then row up rivers like this. And there's a famous monk's poem that he wrote here. He says, "Bitter is the wind tonight." In other words, a bad storm. "It tosses the ocean's white hair. Tonight I fear not the fierce warriors of Norway coursing on the Irish Sea." So he knew he was safe that night because of the bad weather. The Vikings settled some major areas in Ireland, Dublin, Limerick, Wexford, and so forth, lots of the major coastal towns. Sometimes they went inland too. Remember, they could row up the rivers. But mainly they stayed around here. They were great traders as well as warriors. So sometimes they just engaged in trading with the Irish or other people as well. Sometimes they captured Irish slaves and they sold them off to other people. The end of that was at Clontarf in 1014, when Brian Boru, the last High King of Ireland, had a giant battle with the Vikings around Dublin and drove them out of Ireland. Unfortunately, he was killed in his tent at the last moment of the battle. You can see Clontarf here with an icon, and Dublin is down here on the left-hand side. And here is a Viking warrior killing Brian Boru. So it's a Viking legacy, not the music here, but let me give me a minute here. Red hair, blue eyes, and freckles, green eyes, beautiful skin. Okay, all Viking kinds of attributes. Not so bad. 12th century, the Normans arrive in Ireland. A lot of confusion about the Normans. Every schoolboy knows that they went to England in 1066, but most people don't know that they invaded Ireland too in 1169. So who were the Normans? They were Vikings who came down and landed in France in a place we call Normandy. Now, it wasn't called Normandy then, but they were Vikings who were then called Northmen, Norsemen, and it got corrupted to Normans. And we can see a map here of the part of France that they occupied in the darker color. They made a deal with the King of France. We'll stay in just this area and we won't invade the rest if you don't invade us. So they stayed there for quite a bit of time until they decided they wanted to go to England in 1066. You can see Brittany down here on the left of that. That is another place where some of the tribes that went to Britain were from, and some of them went to Ireland as well. But the Normans were the big group that we're talking about here. So here they came to England, 1066. Then 1169, they invaded Ireland and spread over most of Ireland. When they found Gaelic chiefs, they did away with them, okay? Including my ancestor, who was a toughie. Did I put 1206? I think he died in 1208, sorry. Anyway, Strongbow was the leader of the Normans. And he was invited into Ireland, actually, by an Irish king who was fighting for his territory with others. And he was invited ostensibly to support him, but when the Normans got a foothold, they took over a lot of the island. To establish his claim to the island, he married the king's daughter here in this big ceremony. Henry II was very concerned about this because he was afraid that the Normans would grow and prosper in Ireland and then be competitive with his place, and perhaps go back to England and invade England again. The Anglo-Saxons had driven the Normans more to the south in Wales and so forth at that point. But he decided to bring an army to Ireland as well. Now, to get permission, he contacted the Pope, okay? So Pope Adrian IV gave Henry II permission to go rape and pillage in Ireland, and kind of strange. But Henry IV was concerned about control of the Irish church, because in the Roman church, the priests couldn't marry anymore at this point, and they weren't living communally like the Irish priests were in these monasteries. And so he thought that Henry II could get control of the church. Remember, this is before Henry VIII, before the Church of England was established. One of the things that Henry did was he let certain Gaelic lords keep their place. For instance, this is Charles O'Connor, who controlled the area west of the Shannon River, and that became Connaught, Connaught. And so he left him there, and he said, look, you don't come across the Shannon, I won't go across the Shannon and invade you either. Actually, Henry had very little control of the country, because the Normans controlled an awful lot of it. They had 331 baronies throughout. Now, what are the baronies? Well, each family of the Normans got a certain portion here. Now, some of them were more powerful than others, and they got bigger portions. This is down in the south in Waterford. Of course, the head of a barony is a baron. Okay, that's where that title came from. And here's the Pale. You've heard the expression beyond the Pale. Okay, the Pale was the area around England that the English controlled, and they had a fence right here around it, that dotted line. It was a stake fence, kind of like the forts that we saw out west in America during the Indian Wars. The word pallet that you would have to lift up something with a forklift is a bunch of sticks that are nailed together, a bunch of boards. So that word is related to pale, a pointed stick like this. Now, it wasn't just a stick. There was a big mound, and there was a ditch, and they planted some thorny bushes there, but it didn't keep the Irish out. The Irish pushed their way through and invaded sometimes too. But the English really didn't control much of the country at this point. Here's a map of what they control. You can see the Pale is the dotted area up on the right-hand side, about halfway down the island. You can see a lot of the island is still owned by Gaelic forces, the horizontal lines. The white parts are the parts that are controlled by Normans. And even up in the right-hand corner on the top, the Scots came over and controlled a little bit for a while over there. Now, one of the things that the Normans built were moats and bailey. Now, you know what a moat is. Most people think of a moat as a ditch. Might even have alligators in it to keep people from invading a castle. A moat to the Normans was a protective area like a mound. And this is Knock Grafton. I've been there in Tipperary. It's a mound, an artificial mound on the top of a hill. And they built a moat in a bailey there earlier times. Here's a drawing of what people think that it was like. The moat is up on the top of that hill, and there's a keep, and that's where the baron lived up there. And down below, the ordinary people lived, and they kept their animals in the bailey, which is, you know, the bailiff in the court. Here's the bailey, okay? This was an enclosed area. Some other Norman structures later were these square towers. This one is Yates's Tower in Gort. I've been up in that several times. It's a fantastic experience if you ever go there. Anybody know what this is? Bonrady Castle, yes. Fairly close to Shannon Airport. A Norman tower. Some other things that were the things that the Normans brought about were all the Fitz names like Fitzpatrick, Fitzgerald, Fitzsimon, and so forth. Those are, Fitz means son of. Barry, Burke, many other names. They established a system of coin and livery so that the peasants, the Irish peasants who farmed the land, had to pay them coin, money, and livery, hay and stuff to support their horses. So coin and livery was the way that it was established. The Normans became the new Irish, at least that's what the English, the Anglo-Saxons, thought of them as, and they became more Irish than the Irish. They spoke Irish, they wore Irish clothes, they rode horseback like the Irish, and the English were very upset that they were becoming more Irish. They went native, so to speak. Now, if some of you have read my article in the Tiara newsletter about Irish music, you know that Gerald of Wales is somebody that I refer to there. He was a famous scribe, and he wrote a famous book about Ireland and the Irish, and that's a product of what life was at the time. He didn't have a very high opinion of the Irish, except that he thought they were the best musicians he ever heard. So anyway, 14th century, bubonic plague, Black Death spreads across Europe. Here's Dublin. So about a third of Dublin was killed by the bubonic plague. In the 16th century, Henry VIII becomes king, all the Tudor kings. There are 8 of them. The 2 most famous are Henry VIII here and Elizabeth I. And they wanted to get more control of Ireland, and they had some very good henchmen that would help them with it, but they made the Lord Deputy of Ireland, especially Sir Henry Sidney. Now, you've heard of Philip Sidney, the poet. Sir Henry was a very effective administrator. Excuse me. Sir Henry had a system where he had the Irish lords come in and kneel to him and give up their rights to their land, and he would give them a title like Earl or something like that, and they would be re-granted their lands as long as they pledged loyalty to him and to the king. Here's Sir Philip Sidney, the poet. He was an administrator for a while. Earl Grey, I don't have a picture of him, but this is his symbol. And Edmund Spenser, the poet, the poet's poet, so to speak, was another person that was an administrator. These are all courtiers who wanted to impress the queen. They, especially Edmund Spenser, he wrote Fairy Queen to honor the Queen Elizabeth. He actually wrote that in Ireland. He wrote another thing called A View of the Present State of Ireland, which was very negative about the Irish. This was his castle and his estate in Cork, again, very near where my Meanies live. And the Irish were very upset at his scorched earth policy. He burnt down a lot of the houses and crops, tried to kill off as many Irish as he could, burnt down the forests so they wouldn't have a place to hide. So when he was away, they attacked his house and they killed his son. The next major event was the coming of the Spanish. When did the Spanish Armada come to, I'm not seeing if you studied your history, come to England? 1588, maybe? Okay, so 1588, the largest armada of ships ever assembled. Over 300 ships sailed from Spain to England. Lots of firepower there. Hundreds of cannon, thousands of men. They got to England. There was bad navigation on their part. They were big lumbering ships. The English had fast ships, fire ships that they put among the fleet and caught the fleet on fire. the big ships ran into one another. The English weather came and caused them to scatter, and they had to escape. And so they went up around the coast of Scotland, and they came down along the coast of Ireland. All of a sudden, a huge hurricane came up and sent many of them dashing on the shores of Ireland. Now, a lot of people think because the Spanish tended to have dark hair, dark skin, and so forth, that's where the so-called Black Irish came from. Actually, a lot of them were murdered by the English, who rushed to the west of Ireland with their army and killed them on the beaches. Now, along about this time, the Gaelic lords started to become more emboldened with the idea that the Spanish might help them out. And so they started what came to be called the 9 Years' War. Another name for it was Tyrone's Rebellion. Sometimes people get those two confused. It's the same thing. Why is it Tyrone's Rebellion? Because the main leader in it was Hugh O'Neill, who was the Earl of Tyrone. Now that word Tyrone, it's Tyrone to the Irish, or Tiowen, the land, T, of Owen John. So that's how the county got named. Of course, over there next to it, you've got Donegal. It was the land of the O'Donnells, Donegal. But the two leaders were Hugh O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell. And at Clonbrett, there was a battle, and the Irish outmatched the English by a long shot. They had better arms and were better prepared by O'Neill. He was a master of techniques, of martial techniques. Also, at the Battle of the Yellow Ford, O'Neill lured the English into a bog, and they got mired, and then he jumped on them and slaughtered them. So they were doing pretty well at that point. Most of them they lose, but they were doing pretty well. You can see over here Ballyshannon. My meanies were involved in that Ballyshannon one up there, and I'll explain a little bit later that, and also the Battle of Curlew Pass, where the Irish lured the English into a narrow gully. They blocked the upper end of it. They felled some trees at the bottom end of it. The English were trapped, and they jumped down upon them. And of course, if you're fighting with spears and swords and arrows, you're better off if you're above your enemy than below them. And there was a great loss to the English in those fights. So here's Red Hugh over there on the left, and Hugh O'Neill over here on the right. By the way, Hugh O'Neill's castle was 8 miles from where my McBrides and McDevitts were. But I don't think the McBrides and McDevitts were there at that time. I think they came in after Hugh was there. Here's the Battle of Yellow Ford and Curlew Pass. Terrible slaughter. Here's what happened next. You can see Sligo town here, and over on the left, Ballymeany. According to the surname experts, my mother's name, Meany, came from 4 townlands there that are named Ballymeany, right in that area. Actually, they had a much bigger area at one time, but by the time it was made into maps like this one, there were 4 townlands like that. So I'm going to do a blow up here. And you can see Ballymeany up there in the blue on the left. And down here, you can see Dromore West. And here is Dunneil Castle. Again, O'Neill Castle, where O'Donnell came in the winter of 1601 to recruit men to go to the Battle of Kinsale. So you can see it's not too far away from Ballymeany to this. They're only about a mile or so. And he was there on Christmas of 1601, and he went off to the battle. Now, there's lots of evidence that Maimonides, this is the genealogy part of the lecture, there's lots of evidence that Maimonides were in that area prior to 1600. Tons of references in all the old books, but almost no references after that. So this is just a theory, but I believe that a lot of them went to the Battle of Kinsale and never came back. Now, in those days, when an army went off to battle, the whole family went because, yes, the men might be doing the fighting, but somebody needed to forage for food and cook it and take care of the sick and the wounded or whatever. So O'Donnell went off and he probably took the whole tribe with him. I know they worked together on some other things. So he started up in Donegal and he came down here to Sligo and wound up in Kinsale. And O'Neill came down too. Now, a couple of things about O'Donnell. He was very impetuous and he wasn't going to be told what to do. And O'Neill was very methodical and was well trained in military tactics. So O'Donnell got back down there and he saw the English and he charged right at them, but he didn't have enough forces to subdue them. If he had waited for O'Neill to come and they set up their lines, they would have been able to take the town. Well, the town's already occupied by the Spanish. They got the Spanish to come in here. 3,000 Spaniards were in the town. It's up in the upper left-hand corner. See the estuary, the river going out there to the ocean. And the English were on this side, the Irish were on that side. And unfortunately, although the English were starving, they didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough ammunition to do the job. They routed the O'Donnell, and then the whole thing fell apart, and O'Donnell and O'Neill had to go scurrying back to the north, and a lot of the troops that they had with them ran away to the mountains, and I think that's what happened to Maimonides, because they were in the mountains of Waterford and then eventually in southern Tip. So here's the site of the main battle north of Kinsale. O'Donnell comes in, English are over here, and it doesn't work out too well. So 1607, the flight of the Earls. So we're coming to the end here, folks. Daniel, the flight of the Earls, Rory O'Donnell, that's Fred Hugh O'Donnell, and Hugh O'Neill, they go off to the continent because they figured, okay, we can't sustain this here. We'll go to the continent. We'll work in the armies over there, and we'll eventually get them to come over and help us. But it didn't happen. So where did they go? They went to France. They went to Italy, Spain, Austria, and that was the end of Gaelic Ireland. Just as a little postscript here, this is up in the north. This is what happened right after that. There was this family of the Dohertys. The Dohertys means the destroyer. Now, I don't have any good images of destroyer, except this is a comic book destroyer. Doherty means the destroyer. He was a fierce warrior. He was killed. And one of his descendants was Keir O'Doherty, and another one was Phelim McDivitt, maybe one of my relatives. And they went over to Derry, over here, and because of an insult, they burnt the town. And they were killed in the aftermath to the event. There was a reenactment. Here is Keir over on the left with the plume, and the English governor by the name of Paulet, and he slapped Keir on the face and he insulted him. So Keir came back with his army and killed Paulet, and then burnt the town. This is a reenactment. And this is what I wanted to show you here, was that after he was killed, after Caerwis and McDevitt were killed, their heads were cut off, and they were posted on the gate in Dublin as a warning to all Irishmen who would revolt. So that gives you an idea of the early history of Ireland, and sometime, if you like, I might come back and do a little bit more. So are there any questions about this, or would there be questions about any other thing? And yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about mounds and the chamber, the mound looked quite large.
Mm-hmm.
The chamber quite small. So
Yes.
is that the only opening in that whole mound?
That's right. I've been inside of that, and it's a powerful experience to go inside. If you have to make a reservation now. There's so many people who want to go in. Years ago, you could just go up to the visitor center and get on a bus and drive up there. The day we were there, my wife and I were there. Seamus Healy was coming, okay, the famous poet. And all the bus drivers were talking out in the parking lot. They were saying his poems, and they were speculating as whether he would write a special poem for the event. Can you imagine going out here to a bus station and having the bus drivers talk about poetry? I can't imagine it. But it's a spectacular thing to go in there. My son, who had studied all these things in college with comparative religion, was very impressed with it too. Yes, another question? Yes, ma'am.
People from the Baltic, Northern Europe come over?
Are you talking about the Vikings?
Well, so that would be the main groups, then, right? The Vikings that came?
Well, the people that came from the north, the Norsemen, were Vikings. Okay, they called them the Vikings. There might have been different tribes that had come in from different countries up there, but they lumped together all of them, including people who were Danish as well. In Drumna Bay, I mentioned that it is up in Tyrone. There's a small hill there, and about 500 feet from my great-grandfather's house, there's a ring fort, and it's called the Danish Fort because it was built by the Vikings.
It was the Danish I was particularly thinking about.
Right, but there could be Swedish or Norwegian or whatever, Finnish. Any questions about any other aspects of Irish history? I mean, some people want to know why their grandfather came over in the 1870s, I could tell you, or something about the famine or some other possibility too.